Thank you, Acting President. I rise with a heavy heart to speak to the motion put up by Mr. Stuart Grimley from the Darrell Hinch Justice Party about the victims of institutional child sexual abuse. In a society as ours, we fully expect that we are able to protect and redress the most hideous and horrific of crimes, those being perpetrated against the children of our society. The perpetrators should be and have to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And I myself and the government fully condemns any act of abuse against children. Those victims of the child sexual abuse have to endure a lot of suffering, traumas, and difficulties in life. And some of people who were the victims are no longer with us. And those who survive such an abuse have to go through a long-term effects from their childhood to their adolescence to their adulthood, with all the emotional distress, with all the mental issues and physical health issues, with their interpersonal relationship, with their intimate relationship. They can never get over and away from what has happened to them early in life. And not just them, their families, their partners, siblings, and all around them also suffer the long-term effects, the traumas that their loved one had to go through. The impact of this trauma is something that our government recognizes, acknowledges, and have actively sought to address. Through the Commonwealth Government Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, we have heard absolutely horrific accounts of abuse of children by adults who were entrusted with their care. The Federal Government Royal Commission played a critical role in shining a light on the scope of abuse and gave a valuable platform for victims to have their stories heard and considered and listened to in the scope of reform. We, the government, welcome the release of the Royal Commission's final report in December 2017. And we published our response in July 2018. In the response, we committed to taking the responsibility to make sure no child would be failed again, and that the needs of survivors would be prioritized going forward. So every year, we continue to report on our progress on the recommendation coming out of the Royal Commission, and has tabled and published 4 consecutive annual reports on the progress of our implementation of Royal Commission recommendation. It has been excellent to see the new federal government has already affirmed the support for the National Redress Scheme, with the Minister of Social Services announced substantial amount in grant funding to boost support services available to victims, which will go to 28 different organizations that provide redress support services to victims. The Victorian government was one of the very first states to opt in the National Redress Scheme for institutional child sexual abuse. Our work in implementing the recommendation of the Royal Commission builds on the 5-year program of reform to implement the recommendation of the landmark Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry into the handling of child abuse by religious and other non-government organizations. It's termed the Betrayal of Trust in 2013. We have implemented all 15 of the recommendations of the inquiry in 2013, including new criminal offenses of grooming of a child with intent to commit child sexual abuse, a failure to disclose offense which places a positive obligation on adults to report to police where they have reasonable doubt and belief that sexual offense has been committed. And we also implement as a criminal offense of a failure to protect, which requires people within organizations who know of a risk of child sexual abuse to remove or reduce that risk. In 2015, furthermore, we became the first jurisdiction in Australia to completely remove the statute of limitation for civil claims founded on child abuse with the Limitation of Action Amendment Child Abuse Act 2015. This means victim survivors are now able to sue organizations responsible for the abuse they endure, regardless of how long ago the abuse took place. This was a critical reform, particularly given that many of the instances of abuse were historic and the prolonged impact that this has had on those victims' survivors. From September 2019, the Children Legislation Amendment Act 2019 commenced, allowing courts to set aside a prior judgment or settlement in respect of damages for child abuse if it is just and reasonable to do so. And as late as, or as recently as the end of last year, further legislation was passed to support victims and the families and the loved ones of victims of sexual offending to have greater autonomy and control over telling their narrative as a victim's impact statement. A society as ours, we have the rights and the expectation of the protection of our most vulnerable, our weakest, and our children. So recognizing any role governments failing have had on victims is crucially important. And as is the action taken to ensure that such atrocities do not happen again, and that Victoria's children entrusted into state care or non-government care are better and always protected. With that, I like to end my contribution here and like to acknowledge the suffering, the trauma, not just the victims, survivors, but also their families and their loved ones have to go through as a result of what happened to them in their childhood. Thank you, Acting President.
Thank you, Dr. Kew. Mr. Melham. Thank you, Acting President. I'll also rise to speak on the motion by Mr Grimley in relation to the victims of institutional child sexual abuse. In doing so, I just want to say from the outset that, first and foremost, that our government unequivocally condemns any act of abuse against children, and particularly those occurred within institutional settings. These horrible things have been occurring for many decades, and it's abhorrent that any child be abused, particularly an institutional organisation, whether it's a church or a government institution, more than a government, as members of parliament, as members of government, when these children are under our care, we owe it to make sure that they're safe and they're not subjected to any abuse. Unfortunately, these abuses have occurred, and one reason or the other were not dealt with properly over the years, and the perpetrators got away with it. But we have victims of these abuses have to suffer with that. Their families will have to suffer, and they have to carry that throughout their lives, and that is not acceptable. Absolutely, every government, every premier, I apologise, even though for things we have was not committed necessarily under our watch, but it was committed 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. I think an apology is absolutely important. And my understanding, the Premier has apologised, and we all apologise for these horrible crimes, and I call it crimes, committed against children, innocent people, they were in our care, and obviously that's not acceptable. And I hope, as a father, I don't want that to happen to my children. I've got adult children now, but my children went to school in early days, and I don't want their children to be subjected to the same thing. So the point moved by this motion to deal with how we can say to the victims that we're sorry that we let you down, our predecessors let you down, but also I think it's important they want us to make sure that doesn't happen again. That's part of it as well. And I think there's enough, never enough I suppose, but there's a lot of changes has occurred, particularly under the Andrews Labor government for the past 8 years, which post the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse in Institutions. A lot of changes have been made and implemented as part of the, or resulting from the Royal Commissions, and I'm sure more to come. I am sure we don't have a perfect system going forward, but I think it's important to recognise there's a lot of work has been done in that space to make sure we address these problems, or they're not actually problems, these issues over the years, and making sure victims are looked after and make sure that they're able to put their evidence, putting pressure on the state to make sure we are a model litigants. Absolutely. I think that first we should not be going out there, and that was the biggest problem in the past about how we say no and how we stop people from advancing their claims. I think the first approach is we believe you, and then we go through that. And I think the Premier himself has been one of the greatest advocates in that space, and I think it's the right approach to go about that. So definitely we should be a model litigant. On my understanding, we have made a lot of changes to actually reflect that. The last 40 seconds I have, I just say, I'm with you, I believe you. I think this government will continue working with the Hinch Justice parties and other MPs to make sure, and your representative, to make sure we get it right and we continuously improve our response in addressing the issues you're going through, and make sure that you're given the support you need, and importantly, to make sure that does not happen ever again in the state of Victoria. So with that, and I commend Mr Grimley for bringing this motion to the House.
Thank you, Mr Mellon. Mr Grimley, you have 5 minutes to sum up.
Thank you, Acting President. So this apology, this motion is about 2 things. Firstly, an apology for those children who are abused in government institutions, in particular schools, and also an assurance that the government will adhere to model litigant guidelines. Unfortunately today, I've heard very little from the other side, from the government in relation to these issues, apart from what Mr Mellon just said then. I'd also just like to pull up Mr Mellon that the Premier has never apologised for any abuse suffered by children at government institutions. In 2006, Premier Steve Bracks apologised to DHS, children that were in DHS care for their abuse, but there's been nothing for the children that were in government schools. No apology has been made whatsoever by any Premier of any government in Victoria. Thank you to those that have spoken on this motion, in particular Dr Bark for your personal experiences as a teacher, and I do concur as a teacher myself. I know what you're talking about, and Mr Barton on his personal experiences as a model litigant, disasters that he's gone through himself as well, and Mr Finn for elaborating on his personal experiences. Most importantly, thank you to those people up there in the gallery. They've displayed incredible patience today. They've been here all day, all from the very morning till right now. We've had a few delays, but they've stuck thick and fast, and thank you. We've had a few that have had to go home for various reasons, and I thank them as well. Patience is a virtue, and looks like, although there's been no commitment made today by the government, by the sounds of it, in the chamber, which is disappointing. But if anybody can have the patience like you, it's people like you. So regardless of what happens from today, we will continue to fight and box on and make sure that apology does come. And just on that note, I do note that Premier Andrews has said in a press conference a few weeks ago that it wasn't the right time to make a statement or comment on the apology, as the Queen's death was around that time, and that he would have more to say in due course. And today I'm hearing that he said that he would work with victims of crime and look into the issue. Well, I've got to say, victims of crime, victim survivors of childhood sexual abuse don't need any more looking into the issue, all right? They just want an apology. He further went on to say that today is not the day for me to expand on that, but that day may well come. Well, my question is, why wait? Why are we waiting a single day for this apology to come? I've said it before and I'll say it again, an apology costs absolutely nothing. An apology is a regretful acknowledgement of the failures of the system, and that's what it is. But it means so much to victim survivors, their families, and the families of deceased victims, like I've said many, many times. I just do not understand why the delay, why the reluctance to commit to making an apology. I just do not understand why the Premier cannot, at his next press conference, stand in front of people of Victoria and apologise on behalf of successive governments for the failures in looking after the children who were supposed to be taken care of within government schools. So I urge the Premier to make that commitment, to make the apology, and I also urge the government to ensure that the model litigant guidelines are being adhered to. And on that note, I commend the motion.
Thank you, Mr Grimley. The question is that Mr Grimley's notice of motion 851 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against? The ayes have it.